Adrian, big thanks for joining us, and welcome to the Backpage podcast. I know we've the three of us have talked for a while about getting together and recording this episode, and in many ways, there's probably no better time to do it than now, given the sort of ever-changing landscape within the football industry and the wider sports industry. I'm guessing, though, you've been spending the last while at home in the northeast in the sunny northeast of England, self-isolating. So tell us a little bit about what the last couple of months have been like. I know you've been very busy with various media appearances and interviews, and no doubt you've been keeping a close eye on how the football industry has been navigating the current crisis. So what have the last few weeks been like for you?
Thanks, Johnny. It's great to be invited to participate in this conversation as well, so it's a real pleasure. Thank you. Like, I guess, most of the population, it's been a bit of a mental challenge for the past couple of months, trying to ensure that, I'm out as a consultant at the moment, having left my role with Middlesbrough at the end of the year, hoping to find my way back into a full-time role in the not too distant future, but also maintaining a very close interest in the developments of what's going on, particularly with the football industry, with regards to COVID. And in doing so, a lot of media interviews, giving my thoughts on the processes and the challenges facing the various football organisations, and also a lot of different platforms as well, with various organisations away from mainstream media, which I've got to say I found really enjoyable. And I've kind of also thought the new way of working that we've had to adapt to with the various platforms that, like, we're talking to each other now, I think it's shown how important technology is to us now. Thank goodness that we do have everything connected to the different platforms and living off Wi-Fi and social media, because without it, it would have been an incredibly demanding period, not just for people in business, but also living day to day. And I found the communication with friends in a social environment to be a godsend, quite frankly. So keeping myself motivated, trying to maintain a daily routine where I'm, working through the day, making sure I'm in contact with all of my contacts as much as possible, both domestically and internationally, and keeping a pace of where the situation is.
Yeah, I suppose staying with the football industry, I mean, there's an argument that we're potentially in as critical a period as the football industry has experienced potentially in a very long time, and that's in the context of almost every league and association, if it hasn't already done so, is obviously making very difficult and very significant decisions about how to conclude the current league season. Obviously, decisions that will have pretty far-reaching consequences for all stakeholders in the sport. So issues like promotion and relegation being resolved, European qualification, and ultimately what the fairest way of resolving or completing the current season is, whether it's points per game, completing fixtures down the line, or declaring a league null and void. And obviously there are a complete mix of competing objectives that every league and association is weighing up. The obvious one being the health of individuals. You've obviously then got the integrity of competition that a lot of people are emphasising. And then you've got the financial aspect, the financial sustainability of clubs, particularly those lower league clubs. But it strikes me that in this time of crisis, I suppose, for the industry, the importance of getting your communications right with all of your stakeholders, whether that's member clubs, whether that's the media, whether that's supporters, whether that's commercial partners, has probably never been more important. So from your many years of experience and your perspective, just how important is it in times like these that strong leadership and communications expertise is at the fore?
Well, part of leadership for me, communications is a core part of leadership, and increasingly so, and particularly at this juncture in time with COVID-19 that we find ourselves. I'm not convinced that communications as a skill set has always been valued as highly as it perhaps should be in comparison to other professionals for leadership roles. But I think when you see a situation that we find ourselves in now, that came from left field that nobody could have predicted or planned for. We do see the importance of those people that can communicate well. They're stepping forward, and they're receiving a lot of attributes for doing so because it's part of leadership. And you don't have to agree with every opinion that's been set out by people. Paul Barber, I would say, has probably been the most visible person throughout this period, the chief executive of Brighton. And he's been quite clear. He's tried to represent his club, who he's employed by, while also talking about the broader picture as well. But I would say Paul has shown what an excellent communicator he is during this period by the visibility, the regularity in which he's spoken, and he will have carried people with him, certainly within his club. I know that for a fact, so it shows the importance that way. You mentioned the stakeholder groups, and that stakeholder community is absolutely pivotal during this period to carry with you. One section there that we perhaps didn't mention were the players, the managers, and the match officials, in effect the participants on a match day, because without their buy-in, this is a very difficult obstacle to overcome. We really need all of the players to be supportive of this, or as many as possible. And it's quite apparent that there are differing views from individual players for variable reasons, and everybody is entitled to their individual opinion here. So the communications of the medical protocols are absolutely crucial as well, and to give the players and the managers as much information as possible, the evidence that they can take away and talk about with their families, and in the dressing room community themselves, obviously not necessarily always together physically, to give them that confidence that they believe when they cross the white line onto the field of play, that the environment is as safe and secure for them as possible. Right to say that, it's split into three areas here. There is the safety element, there is the sporting integrity element, and there is the commercial element. And actually, all three of them are joined up. They're not mutually exclusive here. I think sometimes some of the narratives that I've seen have actually tried to separate them. In effect, we should be talking about them all simultaneously throughout this. I thought Steve Parish of Crystal Palace articulated this very well recently in his column with the Sunday Times, and then when he appeared on Sky Sports as well. So there's been some people who've really stepped forward. I like the way that Rick Parry of the EFL, when he spoke with the select committee, I believe it was, a few weeks ago. And again, not everyone will have agreed with what Rick said, but I like the fact that he was really clear and very strong with his views as to where he was on the thought process at that point. And at least you went away from that conversation thinking, that's where they are, because otherwise you end up with these vacuums and you're not always sure exactly what it is. Saying all that, Jonny, I do think that all of the people who have been faced with this unenviable position of being in authority at this particular juncture, they're in an incredibly difficult job. And the minute they step forward as an official, they're making an opinion on something they don't always know the outcome of. And within 24 hours or even less, the goalpost could have moved significantly. So they've got that dilemma. So I'm not critical at all of any of the people in authority at the moment, but the importance of communicating with your stakeholder group, considering all of the different challenges financially and the safety aspects of it, are crucial.
I think one of the things, Adrian, that I think a lot of listeners generally would be really interested in, because obviously we've known each other for a while and the three of us have had some really great chats, is obviously you were one of the most high profile, high visible individuals throughout your spell with the Football Association, because of all of the crises, all of the communication challenges, all of the negative and positive publicity that came throughout that period as well. From my perspective, when we've chatted, I always find it fascinating to hear some of those stories, to understand the challenges and to see some of those opportunities that happen as a result. And then that transition basically that you enabled from rights holder, Football Association side, and then into club side, and then what might be next. I think you obviously are in quite a unique position to have experienced almost quite full remit of the football industry in so many ways. It would just be fascinated to hear some of your experiences of FA side into club side and everything in between. If you could share some of those thoughts, it'd be great.
Yeah, of course, Daniel. It really is a very different environment to work in when you're in the federation to a club, and obviously depending on which club that you're involved with. Generally, most clubs are smaller than the federation, and undoubtedly, apart from the very elite Premier League clubs, the level of exposure and scrutiny that you're faced with when you're in an organisation like the English FA, it can be night and day, quite frankly. So I think I became well versed, shall we say, at navigating my way around the internal stakeholder community at the FA. And I think because of my role within communications and my general interest in the whole piece of the organisation, not just one particular block, everyone always associates me just with the England senior team because of the profile of it, which is great in one regard, but it's a bit frustrating at times because, trust me, I was involved in so many other areas of the FA's work, ranging from, promoting grassroots football, the women's game, disciplinary matters, all of the other aspects of regulatory and international aspects of it as well. You can go on and on about it all. Working very closely, particularly towards my, doing my director role of communications and with the England team, with the commercial side of the organisation as well. So you learn a lot. You learn how to try to, negotiate, not necessarily always financial negotiation, but learn to try and get things done as much as you possibly can. I found myself frequently being front of house at the FA because we had a lot of change of leadership during that period, and that resulted in me being in a management team position, often being the person who was expected or asked or taking it upon myself to front up for the organisation, which I quite enjoyed it. Didn't always enjoy it because there was a lot of difficult circumstances. And when you have change of leadership as frequently as we did, you're going to get instability and the organisation can't be as effective as it possibly can. I did think we had a really calm period when David Bernstein was the chairman of the FA. David was a really assured leader, very calm, considered person who come from club football as well. And that gave him a great level of credibility in the game as well. Moving across into club football, and I've worked with a variety of different clubs as a consultant or full-time, as most recently with Middlesbrough. They're much smaller organisations. Again, that then depends on the leadership of the organisation as to how effective you can be. The communications part of that is crucial. But I think before you get to the communications part, it's what are you actually trying to do? What is your strategy? And how are you planning to implement that strategy? Who can you carry with you? What kind of culture are you looking to create? Who's up for that culture? Who's not? If they're not up for it, how do you change that? Because you have to get everybody moving forward in the same direction. But then within club football as well, because of the rhythm of it, the challenges are very different. In a federation, it's every 2 years you play a major tournament, and that can really set the tone for the credibility of the organisation. I worked with the Welsh FA for a year going into Euro 2016, and they had a great tournament, and they were wonderful professional people to work with in a much smaller team than I'd experienced with England. They get to the semi-finals, and suddenly everybody's talking about the Welsh FA being a wonderful organisation. I'm not saying they're not. They were brilliant to work with, but I've also worked with organisations that have not been as successful in context on the pitch, but have still been very effective off the pitch. So there's a lot of different challenges, but I think for me, the biggest noticeable difference would be the size of the organisations and the level of scrutiny.
No, I very much see that in a lot of the work that you've done, and some of the things that Jonny and I get involved with. Day to day, it's almost like sometimes you can speak about it when you work with certain teams or players or agents or organizations that, the only visible bit usually is the performance bit. And the performance bit, effectively, if everything is moving in the right direction, it is easier then to justify everything going on behind the scenes. It's almost like success on the field breeds success off the field, or vice versa. It masks cracks and limitations within particular organisations as well.
And I would say, look at, from my own point of view with England, we missed out on a penalty shootout twice when I was more in senior positions in 04 and 06, and then again in Euro 2012. And, had we won those penalty shootouts, suddenly we're in the semi-final of a tournament, and who knows where that takes you. The organisation then would not have been on the back foot as it had been because of a penalty shootout. And again, that's not blaming the players who missed the penalty. That's just the nature of the industry that we're in. And certainly back in the period of the last decade, in 2004-06, the intensity around it was huge. You then propel forward to 2018. That because of the culture that Gareth Southgate has created around that team, because of the work of the DNA that's gone in by the FA, because of the fact that Gareth gets the whole media and comms piece, therefore the approach to the media is perceived to be a lot more relaxed and accommodating. People swim with them more. But had they lost one of those early games where there was one game in particular, I think, where they struggled and scored a late winner from memory. Had they not done that, it would have been very interesting to see how the mood music was afterwards.
No, completely agree. And I wonder if we can fast forward a little bit to sort of, when I say present day, but sort of current issues. I know we're sort of going backwards and forwards a little bit, but one of the things that I remember we talked about in our prep for this chat was particularly discussing about the current landscape, and even more so than that. I think I read a great quote the other day, and it's meant to be in a positive, is that, never waste a good crisis. And I know that can obviously sound positive and also negative in the sense that we're talking about now. But if we're looking for positives out of the current situation that we're facing with COVID, the challenges and issues that it brings, one of the things we were discussing about in terms of some blue sky thinking was how to possibly be creative, how to stand out in the crowd with particular ideas. It would be fascinating just to hear some of the things you've been thinking about, some of the discussions you've been having more generally about how football can come out of what this current climate is with maybe more positive, reflective approach to things.
Yeah, I think there's two strands to that, Dan, and I think you're looking at, first of all, getting through the initial period, which obviously is a huge ask for everybody, particularly the further down the pyramid you go, because of the financial situation. If a way can be plotted through that protects everybody's longevity, that's the ideal scenario, obviously. But while doing that, it's okay, what can be done, both creatively and bringing a more sensible landscape to football as well. So if you look at the creative side, we're potentially going to be without people inside the stadia for another year. We've got to try and find ways of doing things differently that ensure that the supporters are fully engaged, both insofar as a match day experience through broadcast, but also through their day-to-day, their week-to-week interaction. So that's, what are we doing with social and digital media, which there's already unbelievable creatives in place. You look at the match day experience, I picked up on what Borussia Mönchengladbach have done, where they've superimposed the faces of fans for a small fee, I believe it is, that will be in place for their games within their stadia. And you basically, anything that can add to it, what behind the scenes access can be provided. I know there's a discussion about, do you want to give too much of your content away just because you're faced with a crisis situation? But I think it's really important that we start doing things slightly differently so that we maintain the level of interest. Otherwise, we could potentially have a very sterile environment. I think working together as a collective is absolutely crucial. The more consensus that we can have with the clubs around the table, and there already is a lot of that, the better. I'm looking at things like more centralised selling of rights. I think that's got to make the clubs more powerful. Again, this might be outside of the Premier League, but you can look up in leagues around Europe, outside of maybe the major leagues, where a central selling system's got to be more effective for them, whether it be simply on advertising boards, front of shirt, whatever it may be, something that gives them more power in numbers as a unity. How then we reset things financially with regards to players' wages, which have been discussed. We can't carry on with the wage to turnover ratio as it is outside of the Premier League, and I think there's a lot of discussion going on at the moment with regards to that. I think that will be a sensible pathway forward. My preference, and it may not be the way that's taken, but my preference would be to see a maximum spend per club against your turnover, so that you're not then penalising individual players, so they can still potentially earn within reason what they are able to outside of the Premier League. But it should then protect the club long term. And I just think more and more engagement. It's been fascinating watching Brighton with the way that Paul Barber and Graham Potter have done their virtual press conferences every week during this period. I believe Sheffield United are another club that have been particularly strong on the communications. Then the creative thinking about how they're engaged with the community right across football. David Moyes delivering fruit and vegetables. Chelsea opening the club up to support the NHS with and the food deliveries. Clubs everywhere. Aberdeen have been very good. Up in Scotland that spring to mind. Get as many creatives around that table as possible, feeding in to ensure that whatever can be done is being done.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the broadcast piece there, and one of the things I was reading about just yesterday and chatting to Dan on as well was obviously the return of the Bundesliga last weekend on BT Sport, and just the sheer number of eyeballs on that live broadcast. There's a really good piece by Octagon which broke down the engagement levels and the viewership numbers in comparison with previous live German football broadcasts, and I think it was a 34 times increase in the number of viewers of the 2 p.m. Saturday live games last weekend compared to the average Bundesliga broadcast, and significant increases on actually what would be typical for Premier League broadcasts as well. So clearly there is an enormous demand for live sport, live content, whether that's German football or whether that's more closer to home. So I suppose, again, going back to your thoughts on the creative angle, there is clearly an audience here that is gasping for entertainment in the football context, whether that's live football, whether that's other engaging content. So, there must be other ways that rights holders, clubs, leagues, associations, players as well can be thinking creatively around, ultimately how can they engage that audience.
Absolutely, and that's the opportunity. And I think we've seen, we'll talk about the Bundesliga in a minute, but even this week, ITV, in the way that they have been promoting Euro 96, I watched the England-Holland game, I watched the England-Scotland game. It's actually the first time I've seen both those games in an extended format since they were live. And I think the way that they've done that and packaged it up has been brilliant. We all believe that there is an unquenchable thirst for live sport, for live football, and we can't take it for granted, but that has been backed up for over years with audience figures. I think there was always going to be a peak of interest at the weekend in the Bundesliga restarting because they went first. I've got to try and see this through somebody else's lens because I am a regular watcher of the Bundesliga, so I was always going to watch that, and I watched every game that took place over the weekend. The anorak that I am. I thought in the UK, BT Sport's coverage of it, by the way, was absolutely superb as well, and particularly on Sunday, Lindsay Hipgrave, she really hosted that program very well with Rafa Honigstein and Owen Hargreaves. Paul Dempsey, a great team that showed that they had a lot of knowledge of the Bundesliga, and I think that was important because a lot of people watching will have been tuning in to see the Bundesliga for the first time. The interesting challenge for the Bundesliga moving forward is, will people stick with it while we're waiting for Premier League football or Championship football to return? But it does give you this opportunity. We have platforms now in social media that we never had before 10, 15 years ago. The players now are very clever, and their agents are very clever, as you guys know, about how they manage their messaging. And I think the more that they can reveal to us, and I mean that in a sensible, welcoming way, not necessarily crazy way, but something that can be innovative. It's a great opportunity as individuals. The great use of archive, the great use of documentaries that we've seen, most recently with the likes of Sunderland, Leeds, Manchester City, Tottenham, everything that we've seen previously from North America that we're still catching up with in the UK to a degree. Just the more and more of that, the better. That's the opportunity this creates now. But ultimately, when you're watching football in stadiums without crowds, there's a greater need for that creative thinking. And does that mean that we open up locker rooms like they haven't been before, where that is the great discussion that often crops up and is the greatest difficult discussion. I'm for anyone working in football on the executive side with the team side, because in the main it's something that's always been regarded as a no-go in football in this country.
Yeah. One of the things that we've tried to do on each of our Backpage podcast episodes is, as Dan alluded to earlier, sort of delve into the career journeys and the career paths of the guests. And as Dan mentioned, you obviously spent a pretty significant period of time at the FA, and not just in terms of the length of time is that significant, but also the extent of change that happened within the organisation during your time in obviously those senior leadership positions. And also you obviously have the experience of being part of and playing an integral role in, I think, 8 major tournaments, 5 World Cups and 3 European Championships. One of the things I was keen to ask you about was, and you sort of briefly touched on it earlier on, the experience of being in a leadership position and navigating your team through, your on-field and your off-field team through a major tournament with the pressure and the profile that goes with it. Obviously, some of those tournaments were successful on the pitch, others less successful. How did you find that experience? Did you enjoy it, or was it a source of stress and anxiety? I'm sure it was at times. And what lessons have you learned that you've brought to your sort of more recent roles?
Yeah, I wish I could go back in time, rewind and play again, not just because I'd like to see the results be different, but, analysing myself, which I'm someone who does a lot of self-analysis, particularly reflecting on that period during my time at the FA. And there's a lot of things I would do differently, if I'm honest with you. My micromanagement was way too much, because I'm someone who is a doer, because I came up through the ranks. I think that always made me just part of that group. But, watching people over time who are really light touch macro managers, but still have their finger on the pulse, they are the great managers, and it's something that I've taken a lot from. My experience during that time at the FA with the tournaments, different types of experience. France 98 was a great deal of fun. That was my first tournament. That's where I built up some wonderful relationships with the media that still exist to this day. And I really enjoyed it because I didn't have any pressure on me personally during that tournament. In Euro 2000, it was a different type of experience because I was working more with the safety people and the police and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the Home Office. That was because of the crowd issues that we had at the time. So I learned a lot during that period that was not team related. Really strong sort of corporate comms approach to things. Then I would say Japan, again, was still relatively pressure free for me and an enjoyable tournament. But by the time we got to Portugal was good fun, even though I was in a senior position then, but still had a director above me. Germany was my first World Cup as the director of comms. And the expectation on the team going into Germany in 2006 was absolutely huge. And while, I'm very praiseworthy of what the FA have done in the last few years with regards to the perception that they've opened up and done a lot more with the media, we were still doing huge amounts then. Most of the players didn't do a great deal of media with the clubs at the time. They did a lot more with England than they did with their clubs in general. And so we put lots of plans together, activated training camps, And we also had some very, very big name players with us during that period. A lot of interaction with agents and clubs to make sure that we could get things done the way that we hoped to do so. And the newspapers at the time were really, really powerful. Germany, I felt a lot of pressure. And I really was so mentally committed to that tournament, thinking this is the one, we're going to win this tournament. Not taking it for granted, but just bought into it so much. We obviously didn't go to 2008. 2010 South Africa, of which I was without a chief executive full-time or without a full-time chairman either. Still had senior people from the board around me or back in England, but I felt very isolated in South Africa, which was rather ironic because that's where the team was rather isolated too. I didn't enjoy the tournament, I'm not going to lie. I found it a really soulless experience, joyless for me personally. And I felt very, very... It was the first time as a senior person that I felt that experience that I'm sure many people have, where I felt very alone. Even though you've got people in your team around you, I just felt really isolated during that tournament personally. None more so than the day that we'd been knocked out by Germany. We then had lots of issues over Fabio and is he staying in the job, calls back into England, calls back to me, trying to facilitate the meeting between a senior figure and Fabio just before we went off and did the post-tournament press conference, which is a pretty horrific experience when you've been knocked out, but it's something that you have to do. Quite clearly that, Fabio, everyone has this image of Fabio being this hard man, cold. I saw that guy go through every emotion you could possibly imagine over that 24-hour period. And, did he really want to go and speak to 400 media? Of course he didn't. He did it. It's not easy. We obviously had the English-Italian issue as well. I then spent half an hour after an hour of media with Fabio doing the different sections, myself trying to explain the position of the FA. And it was a long journey back to the airport, and it was certainly a long flight back to London that I really didn't enjoy. 2012 was great. I loved 2012. We were in the centre of Krakow, which was part of my plan with other people. Roy was a new manager, so he had kind of a free hit. I was working with David Bernstein, who I loved working with David and gave me a great deal of support. We complemented each other well. Alex Horn was also in that mix, as was Trevor Brooking as well throughout that period. And we were between ourselves, we were a nice management team. And it was just nice. I enjoyed the tournament. We probably did okay in that tournament. If we got through the semi-final, it would have been a really good achievement. Brazil, so much work went into it. Obviously, a very disappointing result on the pitch. And I knew before I went to Brazil that I was wanting to leave the FA at that stage. I'd run my course. Yeah. So I kind of tried to take some personal enjoyment out of it and be a little bit more relaxed myself. And that was probably the one tournament where I didn't micromanage that tournament. I stepped right back out of it and let the team operations people do what they were there to do. And quite honestly, they were brilliant people anyway. And it was just, unfortunately, it didn't come together on the pitch. So they were with the different emotions I went through during that period, if that helps.
You talk about dealing with that media pressure, and one of the periods, just very briefly, I really wanted to ask you about was thinking back to 2005, which was obviously the Sven era, and was also the era, I suppose, of the media dubbed sort of golden generation. And there's one game that obviously sticks in my head for obvious reasons, and Dan will probably start laughing at this point, which is, I think you know what's coming, Adrian. And I've always wanted to ask you about this, but I've never had the chance. So if I set the scene, World Cup qualifier, correct me if I'm wrong, 2005, September. And this was literally the golden generation. So Beckham, Owen, Rooney, etc. And you headed off to Belfast to play against a Northern Ireland team that were ranked, I think, 120 something in the world.
How do you remember all of this?
I do, and I've got my script.
You're only 5 years old at the time, to be fair. We'd scraped through against Azerbaijan, but a few days before. But yeah, aside from this being obviously one of the biggest results in Northern Irish football history and sporting history, and one of the biggest shocks really in British, Irish, European football. One thing that stands out in my head is
the reaction in the days that followed from the media to that result, which was, it was a result that happens in football, but the tabloid reaction to the players and to Sven was pretty disproportionate, and that's certainly my recollection of it. As someone in your role and the team you had around you, how do you deal with that level of scrutiny and negativity? I know it's a very difficult question, but I thought I'd raise it.
Listen, it's a fair question. I think by that point, myself and the people who I work most closely with on the media side of things, we've become quite robust to it by that period. So I'm not saying that we took it in our stride every minute of every day, because we certainly had our ups and downs, but it wasn't the first time. And I would say, look, that game, I stand to be corrected, but I think that was the only qualifying game that Sven lost.
That's right, yeah, I think you're right.
During his tenure, right? And to be fair, working with Sven was an absolute dream because of his temperament, his manner, and after the game, he's just lost, quite a humiliating victory for him with that team. Take nothing aside from Northern Ireland, because they deserve to win on the evening in one of the loudest atmospheres I've ever been to a game, I might add. But, he was straight out to do his media interviews. He did it live into, whichever host broadcaster we had that night back into England. I can't remember whether it was BBC or ITV. But he did it, as he always did. We just had to take our medicine, quite frankly, because that's what we did during those times. But what it did mean was we were then going off to Leipzig about 2 months later for the draw for the World Cup in Germany, the finals draw. So we put a real big plan in place for that trip to Leipzig, and Sven was unbelievably helpful. And the media were in very close proximity. They stayed in the same hotel as the delegation that we were, as with a lot of other national associations. There was access, and we had a lot of talk about, look, let's make sure that you're available, spend time with the press. And he did. And we actually had a pretty smooth Christmas period insofar as coverage, and it was, he gave them some access. He also spoke to them socially in the bar, gave them a little bit more than perhaps he'd done previously. And then, unbelievably, we come out of that into the January, I think it was, late January. And then we had the fake shake story, which ultimately resulted in the downfall of Sven. And all of the good work that went in from the back of the Northern Ireland game through the Christmas period actually was then totally unpicked. And by the end of January or early February, it was announced that he would be leaving after the World Cup, which then placed a whole different dynamic on that team going into the World Cup.
Yeah.
And so I blame you.
it's all David Healy's fault for that goal.
What a night at Windsor Park! I mean, seriously, as part of the losing group, the noise from that stadium that night was there's about 14,000 there, I think.
Yeah, we had 14,000 because that was pre-Windsor Park redevelopment, but it was 14,000 sounding more like 84,000.
But I'd also say as well, just to slightly digress, those players that I worked with during that time, the golden generation, which wasn't a tag they gave themselves, they did have to deal with a lot of exposure, and in the main, they were brilliant to work with. You mentioned people like David Beckham, Wayne Rooney, Steven Gerrard, Frank Lampard, Rio Ferdinand. Those guys did so much media. Yeah. I think it's sometimes forgotten just how much media they did with England during that period. Yeah. They were brilliant to work with.
I remember at the final whistle on that night, David Beckham, who had taken so much stick during the 90 minutes and took it so well, he applauded the Kop stand at Windsor Park and sort of stayed behind and sort of gestured the home fans, which was a really, really nice move.
Were you at that game, Jonny?
I did say before I'd try not to bring it up on the podcast, but I just couldn't resist it.
I wasn't sure of all the lack of detail that you gave to the question.
Couldn't get a ticket.
Just in a way, actually, it's quite an interesting segue. Just the last couple of questions, Adrian, which was, we've been talking about Euros and World Cups generally. Fast forward not too long in the future, depending on football calendars and COVID depending, we've obviously got Qatar not too far off on the horizon. Are again, like anything, there's always been a lot of negativity on the tender process, on investigations, on controversy, on US DOJ investigations recently, etc. You know, it's difficult, obviously, to be too opinionated on something where there's been lots of opinion already gone before. But you know, what's your general view on where we are now? With hopefully after the Euros happens next summer, and then we've got a few years on before Qatar happens. Then as a result.
Well, I think we've got to project forward. That's all that we can do. And I've had the pleasure of being out there a few times to see their World Cup offices. And, you know, from what I've seen, I think if you're a competing national team that's going to be at that tournament, this is going to be one of the easiest tournaments, probably the best tournament ever, to navigate around because of the geography. The stadiums are going to be, as they generally are tournament by tournament, but they're going to be the best stadiums that we've ever seen. The training facilities will be absolutely first class. Obviously, we already know that with Qatar, you've got the Aspire complex there anyway, but they are building wonderful facilities there. The base camp hotels will be of the highest standard. And I also know just from relationships that I have with people who've done some work out there that, you know, that they've invested a great deal of time and commitment into looking at how they ensure that the fan experience is what it should be. They want to host it as well as anybody could possibly host a tournament. So I think, you know, looking forward, I think it's going to be a really, really strong tournament. And we often, you know, not unfairly, we get bogged down with the debate about the process that had gone on to arrive at the decisions for 2018 and 2022. But people often forget that we had a similar debate for 2006 and 2010. And only recently we saw the conclusion to an investigation in Germany for when they were awarded the World Cup in 2006. So there's always been this level of conjecture for many years about the way that World Cups are actually awarded. I know that FIFA now have changed the process, which will actually probably make it a lot easier for everybody to understand, which is a good thing. But looking at Qatar 2022, I look forward to it hopefully being played with people inside the stadium, a normal World Cup experience, that fans can travel. It can be a welcoming place. And I think the fact that it's going to be played later in the year will mean climatically it should still allow for good football to be played.
Understood. I think if we can just end with one particular question, Jonny and I and the rest of Sheridan's team are always keen on you know, getting personal, but not too personal with our questions. But yeah, in terms of one final question, we always sort of ask if there's, you know, a book, a podcast, an article, a piece of content generally that you've enjoyed during lockdown, anything you particularly recommend anyone listening to or reading. You know, it can be football, sports, leadership, personal development related, etc. Is there anything that's really inspired you lately? Obviously, apart from all the Sheridan's content, you know, taking
obviously other than your content, Dan, which I've got to say is the big tick. I've seen a lot of different things that I've watched during lockdown. A lot of the North American content that I don't always have the time to fully see, and a documentary film on a guy called Terry Fox, who in 1980 he had lost a leg through cancer as a young, I'm going to say around about 20-year-old, and he set out to run the breadth of Canada, coast to coast, on one leg. He didn't actually, unfortunately, complete the whole journey, but he raised millions of dollars, starting off with no publicity, to the whole nation being absolutely consumed by him. Sadly, as he was significantly through his journey, he had to stop running because he felt unwell, and it had spread to his lungs, and unfortunately died tragically on the back of that at a very young age. There's a statue being built to him, but it's a incredibly moving documentary because of the bravery, the determination. You know, if you're an athlete or if you are someone who is a person working in the sports industry who wants to achieve and succeed, and often questions whether it's worth it, whether it's worth the extra yard, whether it's worth the extra hour. I suggest anybody watches that, because what that guy went through was absolutely unbelievable.
Jonny, do you want to end? Sorry. We've done quite a good Carragher Neville double act there. And
Doing well, guys, yeah.
Would that
Please say you're Carragher,
and that would make you Neville. Is that?
I'm not sure how to take that, actually. I think I'll maybe reserve judgment on that. No, I think that was a compliment. But yeah, just to say, Adrian, thanks for joining us, sharing your insights, and as Dan said, we've had many a conversation over the years, but it's good to sort of collate some of those thoughts into a podcast, and we'll be pushing that out in the next few days. So, Adrian, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Thanks, Adrian.